Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of Stern Look, a weekly talk show about journalism and social justice here on HAPS. I'm your host, Peter Stern. Last week, a group of Trump supporters violently stormed the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and that will be our topic of discussion tonight. First, we'll hear from Katie Way, a staff reporter for Vice who's written about the involvement of police in the riot. Then we'll hear from Talia Jane, an independent reporter who was on the ground in D.C. during the riot. One quick note before we begin. We want to hear from our viewers. If you're a member of HAPS, you can post comments and questions under this stream, and we will try to respond to them in real time. If you're watching this on another platform like Reddit or Twitter or Facebook, you can also try leaving comments and questions, and we should be able to see and respond to those as well. All right, let's go to Katie Way, a staff reporter at Vice Media. Hi, Katie, are you there?
Hi, Peter.
So, what can you tell me about your coverage of the riot at the Capitol for Vice? I know you wrote two pieces for Vice about this, right?
Yeah, so the first piece was kind of responsive, quick hit because as all of the footage of everything happening at Capitol Hill was flooding social media, surprise, surprise, some stuff emerged that was basically showing police officers either helping out rioters or, obviously the infamous selfie cop, helping them get downstairs, apparently giving them directions. And I thought it was really important to contextualize all of that stuff for anyone who might have been shocked by it or confused by it, because, if you kind of think about the larger nature of policing and how connected it is with a lot of the groups that were active, like Cops Love QAnon, stuff like that, I thought it was important to bring those two together and really underscore, obviously this was going to happen. And then the second piece I ended up writing was a Q&A with Stuart Schrader, who's Johns Hopkins sociology lecturer, and who's written a book about policing and has another one coming down the pipe about sort of the abolitionist take, if any, on how the police behaved at Capitol Hill on Wednesday.
So you saw evidence on social media showing police officers, potentially Capitol police officers, who seemed to be cooperating with or assisting the rioters who were storming the Capitol building?
Yes, yeah. So there was that big video of them, moving aside that gate and letting a lot of people get closer to the Capitol. There was someone posing for a picture that was caught on a live stream. There was an officer helping a woman down some stairs. Those are just the ones that spring to mind immediately. But there's already, an open investigation into how the Capitol Police may have collaborated with the insurrectionists. I know the selfie cop has been suspended, so we'll
and then
more there.
Besides any of the Capitol Police officers who may have cooperated with the people who were storming the Capitol, there have also been reports that a number of police officers, former police officers or off-duty police officers from other jurisdictions were involved in the riots. They came to D.C. To protest the results of the election, and they were involved in storming the Capitol. So it seems like there's a connection between police officers and the rioters, even if it's not as direct as, you have Capitol Police officers, literally abandoning their posts or opening the doors to let people in. there definitely seems to be some kind of connection, as he was saying, between police officers and the rioters. So, based on your conversation with Stuart Schrader, what do you make of that? Why would police officers have joined the rioters or not seen them as a threat?
Yeah, well, I mean, police officers, especially the off-duty cops who made the field trip to DC, joined the rioters because they agree with them and are on the same team. You know, they have the same cultural concerns, they're friends, they're neighbors, they're the same people. You know, there is a ton of really well-established evidence of, you know, white supremacist organizations infiltrating our police departments. You know, not that how they do it, you know. No, it's just kind of like it's a very similar pool of people. So I was super unsurprised to see that we're already getting all these reports of cops, both like current and former, making this trip and being among the crowd. I mean, I think, you know, there was BuzzFeed News actually reported a Black police officer saying that cops from other places were flashing their badges to try to get into the Capitol, being like, come on, you know, let me do it. And, you know, I think that kind of answers the question about why, it's not the full answer, but why this event was policed the way it was. It's because you're not going to feel threatened by people who you consider your friends. So.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, that these were people who cops, including the Capitol Hill police, saw as their friends, because a lot of these rioters, even as they were sort of overtaking Capitol Hill police's positions and trying to force their way into the Capitol, they were wearing, you know, back the blue shirts or flying flags, or showing these thin blue line patches and showing that they backed the police. And so it seems like there was this understanding that police had that these people were not a threat because they were on the side of the police, until maybe it was too late when they started actually attacking the police officers who were defending the Capitol. So why is it that police officers believe that people who are literally breaking the law are nonetheless on their side and are standing up for quote unquote law and order?
Right. I mean, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head when you talked about all of the sort of police support that was being signaled and displayed in terms of like the flags, in terms of the apparel. This is a little bit of a sidebar, but Thin Blue Line USA had to put out a statement condemning the riots and being like, this is not what the Thin Blue Line stands for. Which is like, okay. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, if, you know, police crack down harder when an event is explicitly anti-police. This was not an anti-police event. This was an anti-Joe Biden event. This was a Stop the Steal rally. You know, that's like nominally what it was about. And so as such, it wasn't something that the police saw as threatening. And I think that led to a really dramatic sort of underestimation of what was going to go down until it was already too late.
And in talking about what the police could do to sort of prevent this kind of thing from happening again, there's been a lot of talk about potentially passing new laws or increasing police presence at the Capitol or in DC when you have these kinds of big protests and big events. But if the issue is that police officers don't view these kinds of rioters as a threat, then would giving the police more power actually help? Do you think you can change their mind? You can show them that these people actually are a big threat, or would that likely backfire?
Yeah, so I think that was one of my favorite things about my conversation with Stuart Schrader, was just talking about what a fundamental mismatch it would be to try to solve this problem with the police, or frankly with any of the so-called national security institutions that we have in place, because they just fundamentally, like, this is not the threat they're designed for. This is not why they exist. I think something that Stuart said that I found really resonant was that, it's really important that we actually totally decouple the police and safety. We shouldn't even have the expectation that, like, oh, if only they had prepared perfectly, if only they had evaluated the threat correctly, if we could show them how they should be thinking about this problem, then everything would have been totally okay. Like, that's never going to happen. The police don't exist to keep the Capitol building safe. They don't exist to keep us safe. They exist to ensure that there is order for the ruling class. It's not about us. Like, I think something that's been floating around a lot is that, multiple times the Supreme Court has ruled that the police do not have a constitutional duty to keep people safe. And I think that pretty much says everything you need to know about whether, increased anything towards the police would have produced a different outcome.
And now, a lot of people who are, well, including some police officers not in the Capitol Police Department, and a lot of people who are sympathetic with the rioters, have suggested that, in fact, the people who stormed the Capitol were left-wing or were anti-fascist protesters, the kind of people who the police are actually very good at policing. And so I'm just curious, we have this comment from Mark Goldman, who is a journalist on HAPS, asking whether you've seen any evidence that Antifa or left-wing groups infiltrated the Capitol Hill protest.
No, I have not. I don't necessarily think I'd be able to speak to this as well as Talia would, because I was not on the scene, but like, no, I don't think that happened. No. Okay.
So the evidence that you saw, was people who were explicitly in, MAGA attire, or, people who were police, who seemed to be involved in this riot.
Yeah, I would say that all of the reporting that I personally consider credible leads to that conclusion.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Katie. Now we will go and talk to Talia. Now, Talia, you were actually on the ground in DC last Wednesday when this riot occurred, right?
Yeah. And to answer that person's question about if there was Antifa or anything like that, no, there wasn't. I can say that definitively because prior to people finding out that a woman had died, they were all very proudly bragging about how they took over the Capitol and they made it the people's house, and they stormed through it because Trump told them to. They were all very explicitly MAGA people. And it wasn't until after news broke that a woman had been shot and killed that they started speculating that Antifa staged it to make patriots look bad, is what I was told. And I think, you have to consider the fact that anti-fascists understand what black bloc is, and they take operational security seriously. They wouldn't have gone in full face showing. And on top of that, you know, all the right wingers, they like to complain about Antifa constantly burning shit down. To which I say, do you think if they'd gotten into the Capitol that they would have left it unburned? Like, all evidence points to it was Trump supporters, regardless of whether they were cops or just regular people, although it's coming out that it's a lot of like CEOs and like financially stable people who are pretty heavy Trump supporters. They did that, and they using Antifa is just like a cover to try and skirt accountability. The only person they found who you could potentially claim is leftist is a guy named activist John Sullivan, and he has been kicked out of every single leftist space he has tried to infiltrate across the country, because people recognize his grift. They recognize that he's just trying to use BLM for self-advancement, and he is putting people in danger, and he is potentially like trying to help cause harm. So even the one BLM person they found isn't BLM. He's trying to claim that now because he got caught, and now he's trying to say he's just like he was just there to document. Like he doesn't have it on his own footage of him being like, I have a knife, here, let's get in, let's go get him. So yeah, anyone trying to blame it on Antifa is probably has something in themselves that they need to reconcile with.
Well, it seems like this impulse to sort of blame anti-fascists instead of Trump supporters is similar to the belief that the Capitol Police had that the Trump supporters did not pose a threat because they're not the kind of people who do this. There's this sort of reluctance to believe that far-right protesters are dangerous.
Right, and then you consider the fact that someone who appears increasingly to have ideological similarities to QAnon blew himself up in an RV in Nashville on Christmas Day. And that kind of goes out the window. Plus the fact that the FBI, as well as Capitol Police and the NYPD, had firm intel that there were people coming to the Capitol with the intent to cause genuine, significant harm. It's not a matter of like, oh, it won't be that bad. It's the fact that that intel wasn't distributed as widely as it should have been. I honestly think that there was a decision higher up, it seems, to not communicate to the people who would be on the ground, to not communicate to them how bad it would be, because there's this BuzzFeed article with a couple of cops who were on the ground, and they said that they weren't told to bring their gas masks or their riot helmets or anything like that. They were told that it would just be like a regular protest situation. And the first time that one of them caught on to the fact that it would be worse is when he came across, like someone sent him a screenshot of a post on, and I think it was like Proud Boys Uncensored or something. It was a post that some had been made somewhere saying that they were going to storm the Capitol, and that's when he knew that it would be a lot worse. But that was never communicated from higher up, and I'm hesitant to give cops a break because, you know, they made a decision to engage in a job that predominantly focuses on protecting property over people. They are willingly paid to be the violent arm of white supremacy. And so I'm not trying to paint the cops that were on the ground as good. Like they took a job with the expectation that they would be receiving certain benefits as a result. From what I can tell, though, it definitely seems not that there was like on the ground collusion, but that there was potentially a deliberate decision to not have the Capitol be as over-policed as we have seen Black Lives Matter protests throughout the summer be policed. And it's, yeah, I don't think we have any answers about that yet.
And you were on the ground. You saw what the cops on the ground were facing, sort of what the situation was like. So can you talk about what was your experience? What did you observe in sort of documenting what happened last Wednesday?
Yeah, that was probably the most horrifying thing I've ever experienced or witnessed in my life. There was like this dedicated collective decision that anything standing in their way was going to get fucked up. And it just so happened to be that cops were the thing standing in their way. I saw cops get bear maced by protesters. I saw them get beaten with flagpoles. They were sorely outnumbered in a way that I've never seen at like a protest that I've covered. Because usually it's the cops that are like extremely there, you know, extremely present. And it was just like this, for me, I recognized that there was no way that these police would be able to hold the line. I knew that. I saw them move the barricades out because the barricades were getting used as weapons against the cops. And that's where you get that video of the people filing through. That's when the line broke. And yeah, it was horrifying to witness, because these are people who claim, like, they truly believe that they were seeking justice. The MAGA protesters fully believe that they went there for a good cause, and that they are righteous in what they did, and that any casualties that occurred as a result are just, you know, the cost of doing business, I guess. But it's rare to see a collective group of people so committed to causing violence as a group that it just it stops being people versus people, and it starts being like this horde. Yeah, it was horrifying.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like that is what a lot of people on the right say about, you know, Black Lives Matter protesters, and it is certainly, you know, racialized. Like, oh, the black people are a violent horde. But obviously, you have covered a lot of, you know, left-wing protesters as well, and in covering those protests, you didn't see people who were so focused on violence and believed that their cause was so just that they would, you know, decimate anyone who stood in their way.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, it's worth noting that there is looting and there are fires and things like that occurred, but those actions happened within the political framework of recognizing that property is not more important than people. You know, I am not aware of any Black Lives Matter protest that has occurred since George Floyd, where a cop has been killed. And these MAGAs had one rally and they killed a cop, and then another one committed suicide. So there has been, you know, looting and things like that, but it's within the framework of that building is not more important than the lives of Black people who are being killed and oppressed by racist, like, you know, white supremacist capitalism every single day of their lives. That cop car, which is paid for by the taxpayers, is not more important than the body of, you know, is not more important than the people that are transported in it and given a quote unquote rough ride with the intent of causing them severe bodily injury as punishment for, you know, existing in a police state. So you can say that protests are violent on either side, but one of them is committing violence against things, and the other one was committing violence against people. It was focused on the people standing in their way. And I think that's an important distinction, because you cannot honestly condemn the actions that happened on the 6th and say, well, there's no, nothing ever was broken at a BLM protest, because it has been. But it's the idea of violence is the difference, because if you set a building on fire, you are not committing harm to another person. If you set a dumpster on fire, all you're doing is burning some trash. If you spray paint a car, you are not causing bodily injury to another person. And at J6, they were beating cops with, I think, a fire extinguisher and flagpoles and barricades and all sorts of stuff. So I think that bears consideration.
Yeah, it seems like at Black Lives Matter protests or at anti-fascist demonstrations, even when you have people who are very critical of police and are calling for the police to be abolished, they are not actually physically attacking the police. They are not, beating them with barricades the way that we saw the rioters last week do.
Because BLM recognizes it's the system that needs to go. If you're putting it into like a class framework, these people, a lot of people, they join the military. They do it because it will give them free education, and because it will help them, the GI Bill, it will help them to get a better head start. And that is exploited by the police as well as by the military. This expectation that people will resort to joining their forces to get them out of poverty and oppression that their forces are directly responsible for. Sorry, I got lost on that tangent real quick, but yeah, I forgot what else you said.
Well, it's interesting that I think a lot of I think police officers genuinely believe when they are policing Black Lives Matter protests or anti-fascist demonstrations that the people they are protesting want to do them harm. This is certainly something that the police unions say. They say that calling for abolishing the police leads people to do violence against police. It puts them in danger. But you actually don't see these protesters at Black Lives Matter or anti-fascist demonstrations physically attacking police officers. They're often getting physically attacked by police officers, but they're not going and beating up police officers.
Yeah,
what you see last week is these people who ostensibly support the police were beating up police officers.
Yeah, the police unions, their job is to both present themselves as the victim, their job is to present police as the victim bully, right? So they self-victimize and they claim that they don't have enough resources to do anything and that everybody hates them. And they work to brainwash cops into this us versus them dynamic where they see all civilians as inherently bad and they see all cops as inherently good, to reinforce this bullshit binary. And they do that so that way then they can have a stronger grip on the communities that they police and the mayors and governors of those cities and states. It's the same bullshit Trump does, or Trump supporters, they try and claim persecution as a means of ramping up their own vitriolic desires. And then when they face backlash for being vitriolic and violent, they go, oh, they're silencing conservatives, It's the same fucking playbook. Am I allowed to cuss? It doesn't matter. It happened. Cat's out of the bag. Sorry.
No, it's no problem. I mean, it's not like we're on, network television. There's no FCC regulation of HAPs.
Good. Fuck the
So,
FCC.
yeah. What has been your experience at other protests? I know that you covered a similar far-right demonstration in November, right?
Yeah, I was in DC for the Million MAGA March as well as the 10 Million MAGA March. And those were in December and November. At N14, which was the Million MAGA, it was just a bunch of chuds like wandering around drunk trying to find Antifa. And when they came across about 80 anti-fascist mixed, it was people with Biden-Harris signs and also people in black bloc. It was like a very weird combination of people. And when they came across them, they just ran up and started fighting. And I ended up getting assaulted in that while in full press block. I was visibly marked as press. Some guy came up and sucker punched me so hard that it split my ear open. And I got fucked up. I think one person was stabbed and had to be taken to the hospital. Another, an organizer, was brutally assaulted and knocked out, and it was clear then, like, you knew before they got there that the Proud Boys et al. Were planning to go to DC under the cover of being Trump supporters. That way then they could then cause harm to anti-fascists. They were literally marching down the street chanting "fuck Antifa" as they ran up, like, trying to find the group. And then the same shit happened at D12. It was Proud Boys and mixed MAGA folks trying to get into BLM Plaza, where a majority of people had been stuck because the cops had like a soft kettle on the area where people weren't allowed to get through. And they kept on trying to like break through because they wanted to fight Antifa. It's what they came there for. And they were explicit that they came there to do that. So when J6 rolled around and they were explicit about their intent to storm the Capitol, people who'd been on the ground before recognized that it was a probably legitimate call that people should take into consideration. And a lot of people didn't hear it.
I think that's interesting because I feel like you were one of a few journalists who, before what happened last week happened, you were warning on Twitter about how dangerous it was, and you were encouraging counter protesters to get out there on the ground and try to outnumber the far right protesters. And that led to controversy because other people believed it would be better to stay home and not give the far right people the fight they wanted, right?
Well, let's be clear here. I was telling people that they needed to show up, and showing up does not necessarily mean being on the ground and confronting people. It means showing up and being active and present and ready to do whatever is needed. There's a significant number of people when fascists roll through who do not have the opportunity to stay home. And they, by abandoning them, by deciding that you're going to stay home and stick your head in the sand, you're leaving those people more vulnerable. And when anti-fascists have popped up in the city, it has prompted Proud Boys and whatnot to go find them, as opposed to going deeper into the city and fighting whoever they see. Like, they assaulted 2 kids riding past on bikes because they decided that they were Antifa. And that was in December. They assaulted medics on the ground who were just there to, like, be medics. And what happens is that when there's, like, there's a large enough supporting base around those people, those intent to cause harm will cause harm to those who are ready to get their shit rocked, as opposed to the unhoused community who has nowhere to go, or as opposed to the support people who are there to try and help keep people safe, or as opposed to the journalists who are there to document what's happening. When there are not enough people providing support in opposition to those intent to cause harm, more harm is caused. Now, I was saying that people needed to show up and like get involved. And orgs in DC were saying, get involved by pushing these hotels to close their doors. And we had people like Amy Siskind saying, just stay home, just watch what happens. I think what she said was something like, let the cops take care of the Proud Boys the way that they took care of them in Oregon. And then she said, I think it will be fun to watch, LOL. And immediately, some MAGA types rolled through. They went to BLM Plaza, which was completely unguarded and completely left alone, and they started ripping shit down and filming themselves doing it. There was no police presence there to keep that vigil safe. And then later, they were going around trying to fight reporters that they saw who were being made unsafe because there was no one there to like keep them safe. The cops weren't doing it. The MAGAs were intent on causing harm because they think all press is like evil because it's people documenting their own behavior, and then they get in trouble for it because the behavior that they're doing is fucked up. And it's just like, yeah. So I just want to be like super clear that the disparity, like the decision isn't between stay home or be on the ground in black bloc with a shield. The decision is bury your head in the sand or find something to do to help those who don't have the option to stay home and bury their head in the sand.
How does that relate to what happened on J6 at the Capitol? I mean, do you believe that if there had been a more organized opposition, if there had been black bloc on the ground, then that would have distracted people from trying to storm the Capitol?
No, because we've seen in November and December that when there's a call to action for anti-fascists to show up and fight, there's still a lot of hesitation to do so. In November, it was maybe like 100 people. And then in December, it was maybe 400. And, you know, this is going up against thousands. So, like, there's a major issue on the left where if there's a call to action and not enough people are showing up, that's going to cause more harm than making the call to action be something remote. But in terms of, like, having, like, a carrot dangling on the stick, in most circumstances, it has been shown in November and December that like Antifa being there has been the distraction. There was no way that Antifa being over at BLM Plaza was going to stop those thousands of people from storming the Capitol. Instead, what I found funny was that like I was telling people that you need to have like substantial turnout in opposition against fascists. And I thought I was saying that to just like the anti-fascists and the anarchists and everyone who shows up in black bloc. And what I realize now is that probably the cops should have heard that advice because they did not have enough reinforcements. And this, like the way that the police were treated against that huge mob ends up being a perfect example of how BLM protesters are treated when they don't have enough people show up for their actions and the cops bear down, or how anti-fascists had their shit rocked in November because not enough anti-fascists showed up to fight off the 2 or 3 times number of fascists who came with intent to cause harm. It's an unfortunate
do you
analogy.
think that the cops should have had more people then to outnumber the far-right rioters? Because as Katie was saying, you know, that might not help if there's this affinity between, it might not just be numbers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're not going to out-police fascist sympathy. You can't bear down physically against something that is an ideological shift. I think that's more to what she was saying. It's not like, oh, just let the cops like leave and then they can do whatever they want in the Capitol and it's fine. I think the problem is that when a majority of your police force is in ideological alliance with those who want to cause harm, they're going to allow those people to cause harm, regardless of how many there are. At J6, yes, if there had been more cops, if there had been a line of 3 or 4 deep, if they had had more non-lethal munitions, they might have stood a chance. The answer is not now to create a bigger police force. The answer is not now to give police more weapons. The answer is you should have listened back then, you know? And so there's going to be this instinct among electeds and everything to increase policing, and it is not going to work because of what Katie pointed out. It's ideological alliances.
Well, because I think we've already seen, President-elect Biden has talked about introducing or supporting introduced bills that would create new anti-domestic terrorism laws or focus on increasing funding to police and to the FBI to go after that kind of thing. We've also seen a hardening of the plans for the inauguration. There are going to be 15,000 cops and National Guardsmen to protect the inauguration, to protect the Capitol. Is that something that, if you have that many people outnumbering far-right protesters, could prevent what happened last week? Or do you think that's misguided?
What I know is that when you increase policing, it primarily impacts communities of color and people of color. It's not going to help because policing is a tool of white supremacy and it is trying to fight off white supremacists. It's the 2 fucking Spider-Mans meme. What will happen is that BLM activists will be more severely policed, and those resources will go towards furthering the oppression and the harm that is caused by over-policing. And this is the case every single time there is a call to increase police presence, is that it gets targeted at marginalized communities first. And it's almost like occasionally, finding a bomb set by a white supremacist before it goes off. Occasionally that ends up happening as a result, but predominantly it ends up hurting communities of color that are fighting to free themselves from that oppression. And sorry, my cat is being extra right now. So everyone say hello to Kenobi.
Hi, Kenobi. Thank you for being on the show. But before we go, I do want to ask, what do you think what happened last week, what meaning does it have for journalists? Like, how should the fact that a, relatively unorganized group of far-right demonstrators stormed the U.S. Capitol, how should that change the way that journalists think about policing and protests and the far right?
Well, what I've found is that a lot of, mainstream coverage couches itself in a desire to maintain a sense of security and comfort in the status quo. And in that status quo is brushing off threats of harm as hyperbolic, because if you acknowledge that they're not hyperbole, that these are legit threats, then you have to do something about it. And a lot of people, when presented with what to do about it, they're like, well, I don't know. This is terrifying. I don't want to have to do anything about it. I don't want it to have to be a thing. And so instead, it gets minimized. And it's like, oh, they're just saying it. They're just joking. And time and again, we see that they're not just joking. They are legitimately planning to cause harm, and they truly believe the things that they're saying. And it's not like the right is not funny. Like, if they were, I don't know what would happen, but the right wing is not funny at all. They're not making jokes. They're dead serious about their intents and their positions and their opinions. They truly believe that Nancy Pelosi should be hung, and they think that AOC should be, shot, and like all these different, like, they believe these things. And what the media needs to do is tap into the leftists, because being leftist is like kind of like being a canary in the coal mine. You recognize that things are going off the rails before they get there, and fucking nobody listens to you except for like other leftists. But you learn to identify the call signs of danger, and you're able to be like, hey, this is important, whether it's climate change, whether it's rent relief, whether it's healthcare, whatever it is. Like, you recognize when things are getting worse, because for the most part, it is impacting you directly.
I feel like there was
right? So when you see
yeah.
Oops.
I feel like
no, I was just gonna say, like, when you see it,
there was a tendency in some of the initial coverage of what happened on January 6th to, I guess, to say, oh, it looks like now the Trump supporters, they're acting like Antifa. And this sort of sense that, like, oh, I guess the far right is also extreme, just like the far left, in this hope of, as you said, sort of maintaining this status quo where, the truth and the reasonable people were in the middle. But you think that rather than say that, the far right is now acting like the far left, it would be better to accept that the far left was right in their analysis of the far right?
Yeah, I mean, I had a piece run the day of. It was probably like 2 hours before they stormed the Capitol. And I had interviewed activists in DC about how they were bracing for, quote, Clanuary. They were anticipating extreme violence. And the response from this, quote unquote, far left was to figure out how to help the unhoused community and to figure out what mutual aid they could be doing to keep people safe. So to, like, create the equivalence that the far left and the far right are anywhere alike is to completely erase the fact that the activists on the left are fighting to make the world a little bit easier for everybody. And activists on the right are fighting to take control and eliminate anyone who opposes or does not serve their goals towards establishing, like, a white ethno state or whatever it may be. So it's important to recognize that, like, the far left's response to J6 was, let's figure out how we can do some mutual aid safely, and the far right's was, let's get these zip ties and kill Mike Pence because Trump told us to. So
I guess it's important for journalists and, the normal people, non-journalists as well, to understand the seriousness of the threat that the far right poses, especially when they are, making these threats, because they are likely to follow through on them.
Yeah. I mean, they literally put bombs at the DNC and the RNC. Like, I mean, I don't know how much more obvious it can be that, like, the actual threat that we are dealing with is coming from Trump supporters. It's coming from people who genuinely believe that they need to cause significant violence in order to abolish the the state or the government or whatever oppressors that they've decided that the only way for them to do that successfully is through acts of extreme violence. And on the left, they've decided to abolish the state by hosting food drives and collecting coats and advocating for abolishing rent, because they recognize that, like, you know, on the right, it's like, oh, if I fire a gun and shoot someone, then that's one person down. And on the left, it's like, how about we try and make things better collectively so then we can all be lifted up together. It's so frustrating. And like media, all they need to do is look to the activists who are ringing these alarm bells, because those activists are the ones most tapped into what the threat is. They're seeing it play out. They're the ones most at risk of being harmed by that threat, so they have to pay attention. Some fucko over in like a newsroom somewhere is not getting death threats for their work. Covering.
No, I mean, I feel like local journalists do get death threats from the far right.
What I'm saying is that, like, an activist who is putting on a food drive is getting death threats for trying to help feed the community. Obviously, journalists do get death threats. Like, it's not good for us. But what I'm saying is that, like, someone who clocks in and out every day, and their job is just a job, like, or, you know, if they just cover like local sports or something, like, they're not seeing in the work that they're doing, that they're getting compensated for, it is not putting them face to face with, I could be run up and shot at any given moment for the fact that I believe that Black Lives Matter and for the fact that I believe people deserve food. You see what I mean? Like, the activists are putting themselves in significant harm to do good. And they're the ones who have the knowledge to recognize when a threat is serious. And the media has this sort of like benefit of having an organization or something kind of like around them to give them a little bit more protection. And it would be beneficial if the media started listening to the activists who are putting their necks out there the most and who have the most to lose in doing this work.
I guess one question I would have is whether it's possible to understand the threat of the far right, or to be a journalist who is kind of trying to talk to activists on the left, or just a normal person who's reading media coverage and trying to understand the threat that the far right poses, and to understand the left's analysis of that, because it is correct, without also embracing left-wing politics?
Well, I think you can look at the playbook so far, right? People said it would be bad, and then it was bad. And then they said it again, that it would be bad, and it was bad. And it seems like those people aren't necessarily, you know, we're not fortune tellers, or like, we're not seeing the future. It's just like, this is known patterns of behavior that if you look and pay attention to, you can see what's going to happen next. Because it follows like a fixed pattern of escalation.
So even if journalists don't want to endorse or embrace left politics, they can still pay attention to what activists on the left are saying about the threat of far right violence.
Yeah, you don't need you don't need to be like a doctor to recognize when you have a cold, right? Like, you don't need to get a degree in engineering to, like, take your laptop to Geek Squad or whatever and have them tell you that the issue is that you need to replace your whatever thing. Like, we have to recognize that like the leftist activists are basically experts at this point in far right violence, because they have to become experts in this. And so like if you're hearing people who have the knowledge and experience, like the hard won knowledge, it's not just like some idle, armchair shit. This is people who've been on the ground, who've been doing the work. And if they're saying to you, this is dangerous, you have to trust that they know what the fuck they're talking about. And unfortunately, there is the consideration of race that comes into play, where a black woman who's saying, hey, this is serious, is not going to be heard.
I feel like the media often turns to law enforcement to evaluate, the seriousness of a threat. Like if you said, who is an expert on, extremist violence, they would turn to police or the FBI, people in law enforcement, people in surveillance. They're kind of seen as the credible experts who can inform the public how serious we should take threats of far-right violence.
Yeah, but then you consider the fact that the cops and the FBI for J6 were like, it'll just be a protest. And all of the activists were saying, this is going to be severe. This is going to be extreme. This is going to be super dangerous. So like, it kind of makes you question the expertise of those who are claiming to be experts on it, because they got it wrong. And it was the activists who got it right.
Yeah, and I think that because of that, so many people were taken by surprise because they had not taken it seriously, that now hopefully you will see some soul searching, and journalists will reconsider who should be considered an expert on far-right violence and on these threats. And hopefully you will see more mainstream publications interviewing left activists. You've already seen an impressive amount of mainstream reporting that is now taking very seriously what a lot of left-wing activists have been doing in terms of trying to identify participants in far-right violence.
Yeah. I mean, and that is not necessarily a result of like the individual journalists so much as the editors and the editors' bosses and the people who get to make the decisions on what runs. Like I pitched the piece that I mentioned earlier about bracing for Clanuary. I pitched that to Teen Vogue, but I also pitched it to, I landed it in Teen Vogue, but I also pitched it to a number of other mainstream outlets, and they were like, no, I don't think so. And then it was immediately proven right.
Yeah.
It's incredibly frustrating to be like, hey, I have this thing that is going to be ahead of the curve if you let me write it right now, and is going to be super outdated. And if you read the piece right now, you're like, damn, they called it, they knew. But if you so I'm going up against stuff like that. Like I couldn't get the piece published in publications that readership most would have benefited from seeing it. And that has happened to numerous people. There's people who are staffed at publications who are not able to write about the issues that they recognize as immediately important because their editors have decided, or the editors' have decided that certain things are more profitable. And or
that they don't want to appear biased, they don't want to appear left wing, they want to be neutral.
But it's the thing in reality. It's a fucking myth. If you're neutral, you're just lying to yourself. I'm sorry.
Well, it seems like one thing that everyone can do to better understand the threat of far-right violence would be to follow you on Twitter, since you were calling it. So there you go. You can follow Talia. Talia, thank you so much for coming on the show. And thank you to Katie as well. I think, unfortunately, Katie has had to hop off. That's all the time that we have for Stern Look now. Thank you to everyone for watching. If you like the show, I'd strongly encourage you to join HAPS and subscribe directly to Stern Look. If you join HAPS, you'll also be able to directly support the show by becoming a monthly sponsor, and Stern Look is entirely viewer supported. So if you enjoy the show and you're financially able to, I'd really appreciate it if you could become a monthly sponsor. If you have any questions or suggestions of topics I should cover on the show, email me at sternlook@gmail.com, and don't forget to follow the show on Twitter @SternLook. I'll see you next week.